Today we're going to talk about managing conflict in small groups. I think an important element to think about from the very beginning is that conflict may be the only inevitable part of a small group project. Success, failure, those come and go. Having fun, having it be horrible, that can change depending on the people. But I think it's safe to say that, like in relationships, if you've studied interpersonal communication, we can say that conflict is inevitable when you're in a small group setting. Now, that conflict might be minor, it might not even be noticeable to some group members, but it makes a lot of sense that conflict would be happening in small group communication, as we'll talk about throughout today's lecture. So, today we're going to cover the definition of conflict so we understand what we're talking about, the subjects, what we have conflict about in small group communication, the pros and cons to think about some benefits as well as potential drawbacks of conflict, and lastly, the different styles of conflict to kind of how we approach it. So first, let's start with the definition of conflict. So what is conflict? Your textbook defines it as an express struggle between interdependent parties over goals which they perceive as incompatible or resources which they perceive to be insufficient. So if we unpack that a little bit, conflict in terms of small group communication must be expressed, which means it must be communicated to other group members. If you're sitting quiet without saying anything, you may be upset about the situation, you may be unhappy with your small group, but we wouldn't say that there's a conflict going on because it's not expressed. The interdependent parties is really what drives that earlier statement that conflict is inevitable. Just like in a relationship where you have independent individuals forming a relationship together, in a small group setting, because you have interdependent group members, it makes a lot of sense that there would be conflict. Each person relies on each other person. That's the interdependent part. And so when you rely on somebody, it's natural that there may be conflict if there's disagreements. That's, of course, the difference between working on a project by yourself, where there is no interdependence, you're responsible for your group, your final product, versus a group where you're responsible, your final project is responsible for by someone else as well. Lastly, there's the two sections, either the goals, which are incompatible. You and your group members have different goals for the project, so there's a conflict over the goal, what we're trying to achieve, or there's resources, which are insufficient. And resources could be time, could be energy, could be PowerPoint slides, could be research, lots of different things. And so there's this perception by one person of either an incompatible goal or an incompatible amount of resources being put in the project. And so when we think about conflict in this way, it's something that's communicated to other group members, between group members, over goals or resources which are insufficient. And as you've now completed 2 group projects, perhaps you can sort of identify if any conflict happened within your groups, if those were over goals or if they were over resources. Hopefully that clarifies what it is we're talking about. We're talking about conflict. Next, we can talk about what is the subject of conflict. What do we have conflict over? And there's 4 different areas. The first one is a conflict over substance. This is substantive matters, choices, things that are true or false, right or wrong answers. You can think of these as task roles. So we have a disagreement over the substance. When is the project due? Is it due on Monday or is it due on Wednesday? What is the topic of our project? Is it this or is it that? Should we create a PowerPoint slide? Should we create a Google Slides? Should we create a video? Those would all be substantive matters. And generally, conflict over these get resolved pretty easily because you can usually look up the correct answer. You can double check the assignment to see when it's due. But of course, there are some strong conflicts over substance when you really feel like your way is better than your group member's way. You might have a pretty strong conflict over substance. But it's like a substantive matter, something that could be determined. Oftentimes, a good resolution strategy for this is to bring in a third party. You each present your case, and then you have a different decision. Right? So if you and a group member are disagreeing over something, sometimes you can bring in a third group member, each of you present your case, and then you can talk about a solution. Another area of conflict is value. This means it's different what's important to group members. Sometimes this can be goal related, right? What do you value? Do you value a good grade? Do you value a perfect presentation, or do you just value getting something done, right? Like, is it important that all of my triangles line up exactly on this PowerPoint slide? Or if it's slightly off, that's okay, right? What do you value in your group? And these are often difficult to express, to communicate. Oftentimes people have difficulty putting their values into words. And so sometimes this can be a very frustrating form of conflict because I simply value something different than you do. And it's difficult for me to put into words my own values and your own values. And it's also sometimes hard to come up with a compromise or a solution to this type of conflict because what you value is what you value, and it's sometimes difficult to change those values. If I value perfection in the PowerPoint slides and you don't, there's really no middle ground there, right? Usually it's just, I'll go in and fix everything and be very frustrated over it. And you'll be like, meh, whatever, go ahead, do that if that's important to you. So that's sort of the key phrase, if that's important to you. A third subject of conflict is the process. This is how we disagree on how to communicate, how to do the process of our small group communication or the process of our project. You can think of these very much as social roles. So in reading some of the reflection papers for the scholarly report, it seemed like this came up a lot. How are we going to communicate? Are we going to have a Zoom meeting? Are we going to use FaceTime? Oh, somebody doesn't have FaceTime on their phone. That's not going to work. Why don't you get a FaceTime phone? And that's, conflict over process. Are we going to do a group text? Are we going to do a Google Doc? Right? And so people can argue over the process of how we're going to communicate. It's different than substance because it doesn't have anything to do with the actual project itself, but more of the how are we going to communicate? How are we going to get this project done? And this is what a lot of the early conflict in small group communication can look like because we disagree about how we're even going to approach this. Lastly are misperceptions. And this is a very common conflict in small groups because it deals with conflict over misunderstandings or miscommunications or just confusion within the group. I thought you were going to turn this in by midnight, but your understanding was that you were going to turn in by noon. And so there's a misperception there over when this is due. Or I thought you were going to complete the PowerPoint slide. You thought I was going to start the PowerPoint slide, so you were waiting for me to start it before you completed it, and there's just a misperception. This is where having detailed meeting notes is often very helpful, assigning somebody to take notes and making sure there's a clear understanding at the end of the meeting what each person's responsibility is going forward. It can help a lot with misperceptions. But it's also, I think, just one of the inevitabilities of doing small group communication. There's going to be confusion, there's going to be misunderstandings, misperceptions, and it's something we just have to work through, recognize, correct, and move on and not get too upset. Next, we'll talk about the pros and cons of conflict. And so there are definitely some drawbacks to having conflict in small groups, if I'm sure you've all experienced these. But of course, it can make group members feel bad. A lot of people dislike conflict. We're not comfortable having conflict with our group members. So it makes us feel bad. It makes us not enjoy the group. It may force us to withdraw from the group or ignore the group or go off on our own and simply do the whole project by ourselves just because it's uncomfortable having conflict. Especially in person. I'm not sure quite what your experience is doing remote conflict, but that might even be more uncomfortable. Next, we have reduced cohesiveness. Of course, conflict can reduce group member buy-in. We talked about motivation last week. It might reduce your motivation to work with the group, to care about the group, to put in the effort for the group, because the conflict is just making you not like your group members. Next, it can, of course, split the group. You've probably experienced this, where there kind of becomes two camps. One camp wants to do a PowerPoint slide, one camp wants to do a video, and now we're sort of at a deadlock. And the group is doing a PowerPoint, makes the PowerPoint, the group is doing the video, makes the video, and nothing's quite working well together. So definitely conflict can split the group and takes a lot of effort to bring that group back together. Social roles can help a lot there. And of course, physical violence, hopefully that's never happened, but people get so upset they resort to blows. But hopefully, especially in our virtual world now, small group communication, hopefully that won't be an issue. This is summed up by, in the textbook, it talks about the cancer model of conflict, where conflict is seen as an insidious and incessantly expanding element, which, if left to itself, will inevitably overwhelm and destroy a group. Right? So conflict needs to be stopped. Conflict needs to be extracted from the group. Needs to be avoided at all possible, and that it's really nothing good. Right? Conflict can only destroy and overwhelm the group. That's the cancer model. That's the negative side of conflict. But as we've talked about, there are also potentially some benefits of conflict in a group, just like in interpersonal communication. One, it can be seen as a sign of comfort. We're having this conflict because we trust each other, we understand each other, we can get through this conflict. I feel comfortable expressing my opinion within the group, and I feel like we need to go in a different direction. So that's one potential way to see conflict as a positive. People feel comfortable at least expressing their conflict as opposed to holding it in. Next, it helps us find the best solution. And this is the idea that if somebody disagrees with a plan for your group, it might be because it's a bad plan. And by airing out different points of view, different viewpoints on the topic, maybe you'll come up with a compromise, create that synergy where groups who work together can create something better and more than each individual working on their own. It can increase understanding of the material. If we think about that misperception source of conflict, this can help reduce misperceptions. We disagree over something, we talk about it, we realize we just misunderstood each other, and now we better understand the material, better understand what we're talking about. And then lastly, it can increase cohesiveness. That by working through the conflict, you can potentially realize that you can trust your group members, you can solve problems that your group members have, and it can increase cohesiveness. In the textbook, this talks about how this can be best captured by the friction model, that conflict is seen as a natural byproduct of human relations. Again, if you study interpersonal communication, I'm sure you've covered this, where conflict is seen as inevitable, conflict is seen as good for relationships, two independent people coming together, or in small group communications, multiple independent group members who come together and depend on each other will naturally have conflict. In interpersonal communication, we talk a lot about how if you're in a relationship with no conflict, you're in a relationship with conflict, it's just not being expressed. So hopefully that kind of clarifies what the friction model sees conflict as a benefit, because it sort of irons out those edges and polishes the group, makes it smoother. Lastly, we'll talk about a few different styles of conflict. We'll talk about this more in the next video, next week. But there's a lot of research into sort of how we approach conflict and if that's helpful or not helpful for the small group. First is the non-confrontational style. We avoid expressing conflict because we see conflict as a lose-lose relationship. Right? If I disagree with the direction my group is going, by me expressing that conflict, it's just going to create a fight. It's just going to create anger. People will get mad at each other. There'll be less work done. So I'm just going to not say anything and not bring up my concerns with the group. As I mentioned before, the non-confrontational style doesn't mean there's no conflict. It just means the conflict isn't expressed. It doesn't mean that everybody's happy. It just means that the people who are unhappy don't feel comfortable sharing their conflict. And so again, if you think back to the friction model, people sharing their conflicts with the group is actually usually a positive sign that people feel comfortable and people feel like they can express themselves. And viewing it in that way, sometimes conflict is actually seen as a positive. We're all in this together. Next is the controlling style. This is where we monopolize discussion and we view conflict as a win-lose situation. It's a game, it's a battle. One of us is going to win and one of us is going to lose. And if I argue better than you, I win the conflict, you lose the conflict, and we get to do it my way. This is often a very negative style for conflict resolution. It leads a lot of people to withdraw. If you've ever had really bad group experiences, you might be able to identify a controlling style happened within conflict. Because guess what the person who loses the conflict does? They usually just withdraw from the group. They'll stop working, stop caring, and it's no fun to lose. And so if you view conflict as win-lose, It often also leads to very unethical behavior. Maybe you just forget to include the person's email on the Zoom meeting invitation, and so they never show up to the meeting to present their point of view. So guess what? You've won the conflict, but in winning, you've probably destroyed the group, right? And now you're going to have to do that person's job because they're going to withdraw. The cooperative is the recommended style. This is the win-win orientation to group conflict, where conflict is seen as a chance for both parties to express their point of view, both parties to put their input into the group, and both parties to hopefully come up with a solution that addresses both sources of concern. This is, of course, the most difficult one to do. I think we've been raised in our society with a win-lose, a controlling style. But if you can adopt the cooperative win-win approach, you're going to be much more successful and your groups will be much more enjoyable. So which one are you, do you think? Try to think about your last 2 group projects and try to see where you fall on this. All right, so to summarize today, we've talked about the definition of conflict. We've talked about different subjects we have conflict over in small group communication. We talked about some pros and cons, some benefits and drawbacks to conflict, the 2 different models, friction and cancer. And lastly, we talked about a few different styles of conflict that you can use.